Hi, this is Bastiaan, and today we're going to take a look at a rarely seen opening, which is the Brussels Gambit of the Sicilian defense. And the Brussels Gambit, of course, is named after Brussels, which is the capital of Europe. I used to live there for a short while working for a Swedish company. But the Gambit itself starts out with E4, then C5, signaling the Sicilian, knight to F3, and now black plays F5. So the point of this is to undermine the center, as we are doing with the C5 move. So C5 basically prevents black from playing an immediate D4, with the point being that black can exchange a flanking pawn for a center pawn, and black mirrors this approach with the F5 move. But the F5 move has some issues because it opens up a diagonal to the king. So this move is actually very reminiscent of the threat defense. So if you're good at playing the threat defense, you'll feel right at home playing this gambit, because a lot of the tactics we see there we will see here as well. Black takes the pawn, and now we can see the point of the gambit. I can use my bishops to recapture the pawn on F5 or C5, or defend my pawn on F5 or C5. The center has become open for pawn pushes with D4, D5 or E5, now or later, and the king has become exposed on E8. So the game continues with knight to C6, a classical Sicilian move, and white could play D4, after which I can continue with my plan to take control of the center, and if white takes, I can recapture my pawn on C5 later on, when I take control with of the center with E5. But my opponent plays a very aggressive move, knight to G5, immediately capitalizing on the weakness of my king on E8. So he has opened up a diagonal and is looking to play Queen to H5. I continue with knight to F6. So there are two possible moves. If not knight to F6 is played, I could play H5. H5 brings in the rook as a defender of the H5 square. Knight to F6 defends that square as well. White adds another attacker, bishop to E2, and I'm forced to play H5. Now, my opponent is probably unaware of the Brussels Gambit, but he's a FIDE master, so he plays another strong move, knight to E4. A move that does two things. It undermines my defender on F6, and it attacks the pawn on C5. So if I want to defend my pawn on C5, I have a few ways of doing so. I can play D6, E6, but I choose the more aggressive queen to A5, developing the queen. White exchanges the knight, and now we can see we have some issues in king defense. The diagonal is open, a defender has been lost, and white now has a battery on the F5 pawn. White of course plays bishop to H5, check. I have to move my king, and now bishop to G6, locking in the bishop on the G6 square and having opened the diagonal for the queen. Now we have lost the privilege of castling, but our king is relatively safe in the center on the d8 square. I play b5, and now it becomes difficult for white to find a good attacking move, because he has developed in order to attack my king, but now that's no longer possible, and he's getting behind in development. So possible moves would be castling or develop the knight. We'll get back to that a bit later, but for now white plays a waiting move, h3. A waiting move, but it also prevents attacks of the rook on the half open file. Now castling would have been possible, developing the knight would have been possible, but we can see that moving the pawn on d2 would not have been possible with the aggressive queen placements on a5. And without this pawn moving, this bishop is useless. So I continue development with bishop to b7. White castles. Knight to e5. Developing the knight, but also threatening recapturing the pawn after an exchange, after which this pawn will become overextended. Now there are a few continuations possible for white. Knight to c3 is possible, but we can play b4 and immediately attack the knight. And although the knight can develop or retreat, we can see that there are very few squares for white to move to. So knight to c3 wasn't played. If a random move is played, like a3, we can see the threat that black has built up. We can now play queen to c7, adding two adjacent diagonal attackers, and we can see 4 pieces pointed to the king, and we can probably crash through in a few moves with knight to f3 check. So if, say, knight to c3 at this point, knight f3 check, of course the queen cannot recapture because the bishop is protecting the f3 square. Pawn takes, and now we can recapture the h3 pawn, which is no longer defended, and threaten queen to h2 checkmate. So this is already easy to spot. So random moves and developing the knight all seem a little bit pointless or dangerous. Black plays d4 instead, opening up a diagonal for the bishop. Now I recapture, and now white has to be very careful in order to recapture this pawn on d4. I was hoping he would recapture, but he's seeing the issue. If queen recaptures at this point, we can see there's no longer a defender on the f3 square, after which I can already crash through. Rook takes pawn, and if pawn recaptures, knight to f3, check with a fork, queen to g2, knight takes queen, check, king moves or pawn blocks, knight grabs another pawn and attacking the trapped rook on a1. So we can already see what a poor position white has. Unfortunately, white doesn't recapture the pawn, and he sees the danger. Instead, he continues with bishop development, bishop to f4, trying to remove one attacker, the knight on e5, and recapture the pawn on d4 later. So we can already see that white has counter-sacrificed the pawn in order to regain his development on d4, and also this pawn on f5 is overextended, and we can get that pawn back as well. Meanwhile, we have a better development and an attack on the king side. So I continue with, well, we should check if we can crash through at this point. If you were to try, say rook takes pawn, bishop recaptures, pawn recaptures, and pawn takes rook, and we can see that we don't have enough pieces left in the attack, so crashing through at this point is probably bad. I continue with the original plan, trying to recapture that pawn. Knight takes bishop, pawn recaptures, and e5, protecting my overextended pawn on d4 and gaining tempo with an attack on the bishop. So the bishop retreats to c1. White has succeeded in activating his bishop, but he has sacrificed the pawn in doing so and was forced to retreat his bishop. Now we can continue to attack the pawn on g6. So I play queen to b6, the point of which is to play f5 at some point and attack the pawn on g6, and then the queen will be perfectly placed, attacking g2 square on the half open file, which is also being attacked now currently by the bishop on b7. So if say a3 is played, f5, b3 perhaps, queen takes, that's the point. Black plays queen to d3 instead, protecting the pawn on g6. Rook to the half open file, f3, trying to blunt the bishop on b7, and now I play b4, and the point is to skewer the queen and the rook with bishop to a6 move. Rook to f2 to prevent that, bishop to a6 anyway, gaining more development and remaneuvering the bishop to a better square and a better diagonal. Queen to e4. Of course the queen needs to protect the g6 pawn. Bishop to c5. So now I'm doing or going to try to do the same thing, making a battery on with the queen and the bishop, and I'm going to push the d pawn in order to skewer the rook and the king. So king to h2, d3. Now the rook has to move, and there are a few places for the rook to move to. If rook to f1 was played, we can grab the pawn and we can attack the knight and the rook at the same time. So if knight to d2, I can grab the rook and the knight can recapture, and black will have won an exchange. This wasn't played, of course. Rook to d2 was played in order to block the advancement of the d3 pawn. So bishop to e3 to get rid of that rook and to keep pushing the d pawn. Rook to d1 is not possible, because then we can play pawn takes pawn, attacking the rook. Rook to h1 perhaps, and pawn takes knight, promoting to a queen, gaining a minor piece. So rook to d1 wasn't played, meaning white will lose a rook. c3 was played instead, and instead of immediately grabbing the rook, I play an in-between move, bishop to f4 check, forcing the king back to the h1 or f1 square. Now this move may or may not be important, but it doesn't hurt to play it. There's nothing white can do against it anyways. But it turns out that this move will influence the game significantly. King retreats, and we can see there's no longer a second protector of the h3 pawn. Now we grab the rook, knight recaptures. Rook to g8, another attempt to attack the g6 pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook to c2, making a rook outpost on the second rank. We can't capture the pawn yet because of the queen that is still protecting that pawn. Queen to a8, check. Bishop blocks. So we can see that although our king has moved all the way to the center without castling, it is still pretty well protected. Now, if queen to e4 were to be played in order to protect the pawn, black can continue with queen to c6, which will force an exchange, and white will lose a pawn on g6, and we will be approaching the endgame with black being an exchange up, a rook for a minor piece. So queen to e4, retreating to protect the g6 pawn, is a bad move for white. So instead white plays queen to d5, attacking the rook and the pawn on d3. Rook takes the pawn, and white recaptures my pawn on d3, getting rid of the dangerous d3 pawn and attacking my rook on c2, which no longer is an outpost. So I play rook to g3, sacrificing my rook on c2, or offering up my rook. And now you can see how important it was to make white retreat his king to h1, because we have a hole on the g3 square. White grabs the rook, queen to f2, and we can see the mate threat. Knight to e4. This forks queen and rook, but allows an attack on discovered attack on the queen on c2. But white has little choice. I will grab the queen in exchange for my rook, but I grab an additional pawn with the in-between. Rook takes pawn on h3 check, pawn recaptures, and now I grab the queen. I've gained a pawn, but I'm offering up the pawn on f6. Also I'm up the exchange, queen against rook. Knight takes pawn. And now we will continue with our mate threat, but it's perhaps not obvious which move black should play. So if we were to play a random move, let's say a6, we can still see that white can annoy us with playing bishop to g5, activating the rook, and threatening a discovered check with the bishop on g5. So black should develop or move his queen in order to attack the f3 pawn. But there are a few ways for black to do so, and they are not all equal. So let's say if queen to f5 were to be played, which looks like the best choice, because you're forking or attacking both the knight on f6 and the pawn on f3. But then white may continue with knight to g4. Now if bishop to b7 were played in order to make a battery and attack the f3 pawn, white may continue with king to h2, queen takes pawn, threatening mate, but white can develop with tempo, bishop to g5 check, king moves, and rook to g1. And this move protects against the mate on g2 and h1. So that's probably not best. If you go back a few moves, and in this position, instead of playing bishop to b7, we take the pawn immediately with queen takes pawn check, king moves, but we can no longer check with queen to f2 because the knight is covering that square. So bishop to b7, White again may play check. King moves, and now again the rook may step in, protecting g2 and h1. So if you go back, the queen to f5 move is out. We can't play that. Perhaps queen to f2, attacking the pawn. White continues with knight to g4, attacking the queen. So we need to move the queen. Queen takes pawn check. King to h2, bishop to b7. Again bishop to g5 check. King to e8 and rook to g1, protecting both squares. So again, this move doesn't seem like the best choice. But there is another move that does work, and that's queen to e2, attacking the pawn on f3. So we have to keep in mind, we have to develop the queen to attack the f3 pawn. So if at this point, say knight to g4 is played, we can play bishop to b7, bishop to g5 check, activating the rook. King moves, and if rook to g1 now, we can see that at this point black has a choice to recapture the f3 pawn. He doesn't have to recapture with the queen. So if queen takes, which is bad, king to h2, and we can see the same problem for black. But if you play bishop takes, check, there's no longer a possibility for white to defend. So rook blocks perhaps, and a mate. There's no escaping. Alternatively, if you play queen to e2, instead of knight to g4, white plays bishop to g5 for a discovered check. Queen takes check, king to h2. This was played, by the way. Queen to f2 check. There's no longer a knight covering that square. King to h1. Bishop to b7 check. No possibility for white to block with the rook. So knight to d5, discovered check. King to e8. Rook to d1, attempting to block the diagonal and solidify the blocking knight on d5. Queen to f3 with the triple fork. King moves, queen takes rook. Knight to f6 check, king to f8, bishop to h6 check, king to f7. Knight to g4, queen to e2 check, king to g3, queen to e1 check, knight to f2, queen to g1 check, and we can see there's only one square for a white king to move to. King to h4, and finally queen takes knight check, and at this point, with only one minor piece, white decides to resign. So we can see that even in the endgame, we have to pay a little bit of attention in order to choose the right move order in order to mate our opponent. So I hope you enjoyed watching this game. There are a few different tactics involved. I hope you enjoyed the Brussels opening. It can be very fun to play, especially if you're not afraid to play with an open king side. And I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please leave a comment. Have a great evening.